So the question comes about, why is cell size limited? Meaning, why is it that cells don't just get gigantic? Why can't single-celled organisms be much bigger than they are? And why are multicellular organisms made of lots of little tiny cells rather than just a few really large ones? And so we're going to answer this question in a mathematical way, but first, let me give you a brief explanation. First of all, if we imagine this box as a cell, one of the things that's going on is metabolism, meaning the use of energy. So imagine in this cell, we know that nutrients have to get into this cell. And we also know that waste is constantly being produced and that waste has to get out of the cell. Now, not only do nutrients have to get in and waste has to get out, but it has to get all the way to the center of the cell, and waste being made has to get all the way out of the center of that cell. So the bigger the cell is, we can imagine that the longer, if we keep the same shape, the further that distance is going to be to get all the way to the middle of that cell. And eventually what's going to happen is that stuff just can't make it that distance fast enough to keep that cell alive. Now, mathematically, we can also explain this. So mathematically, the deal is this. If we look at our cell, the amount of exposed surface, if we colored our 6 sides of this cube, is called our surface area. And the amount inside, let's just say this contains 5 milliliters of solution, that's our volume. And what we find is that in order for a cell to survive, we need to have a lot of surface area. But unfortunately, what we find is that as a cell gets bigger, if we double the size of the cell here, what we find is that our surface area will increase by a factor of n squared, whereas our volume will increase by n to the third. It's cubic. Bottom line is this. The surface area does not increase as fast as the volume does. So if we keep this same shape and we just keep getting bigger and bigger, we end up with just too much inside and not enough exposed surface for stuff to get in and out fast. So what I'm going to show you next is mathematically how we can calculate the surface area to volume ratio for different shapes of cells. And then from there, we can determine which cell from various choices would actually be the most efficient cell, the one that would be the most likely to survive, that could get things in and out the fastest. All right, so this is a snip of the formula sheet that you actually get for the AP exam, and you'll notice that it has the formulas for surface area and volume of different shapes. So first, if you look for a sphere, we can see here's surface area and here's volume. For a cube, our surface area is here, 6 times the area, which is the same as 6 times length times width. And our volume is length times width times height. And then finally, for a square column or a rectangular solid, I don't like the formula that they provide you. They tell you that it's the sum of the surface area of each side, so I rewrote down here at the bottom. The best way to do it for a rectangular solid is to do length times width plus length times height plus width times height and multiply it by 2. And I'll walk you through it. But that kind of gives you a better, walkthrough of what to do. And the volume of your square or rectangular solid is, again, going to be length times width times height. So let me show you on the next slide a sample of each. Okay, so I rewrote the formulas here. And we have 3 cells. I gave you a cube, a sphere, and a rectangular solid. What we're going to do is we're going to calculate the surface area and the volume, and then the ratio of surface area to volume, which is simply that we're going to take the surface area that we get, divide it by the volume, and that's going to give us a surface area to volume ratio. And from that, we can compare them. What we're looking for is when we do this division, whichever number is the biggest, that's going to be our best cell, because it's going to have the most surface area to volume. So let's look at our first one. All right, so for our cube with a side length of 5 centimeters, so you can imagine this cube is basically just 5 by 5 by 5. Our surface area is going to be 6 times the area, or 6 times the length times height, which is going to be 6 times 5, which ends up being 150 centimeters squared. And our volume is, again, length times width times height. So this is 5 times 5 times 5, and that's 125 centimeters squared. Okay, and that means that our surface area to volume ratio, if we put our surface area over our volume, ends up being about 1.2 to 1. In other words, we have 1.2 centimeters of surface area per unit of volume, which doesn't really tell us much yet. We're going to work out the other two, and then again, we're going to look for our biggest number here. Okay, so for spheres, you can see the formula here. Now, you actually do not have to plug in pi. You can. You can take pi and you can plug in, 3.14, but it's not necessary because in the end, what's going to happen is if you're going to divide surface area divided by volume, pi is going to end up canceling. So if we calculate our surface area here, it's going to be 4 times our radius squared, which is basically going to be 16 pi centimeters squared. And our volume, when we calculate it, is going to end up being, it's going to be 4/3 times 2 to the third. And I rounded that to 10.667 cubic centimeters. And now we're going to do our ratio. And so we do 16 pi over 10.667 pi. And our ratio comes out to be about 1.5 to 1. Now, so far, that means that our second cell, our sphere, is more efficient than our first cell because it has 1.5 units of surface area per every unit of volume. So let's work out our third one. All right, so as I mentioned, I don't really like their formula that they give you. It's the correct formula, but technically what you want is 2 times your length times your width plus your length times your height plus your width times your height. This way you'll make sure you end up multiplying everything together. So this is going to be 2 times, and then 6 times 4 plus 6 times 0.5 plus 4 times 0.5. All right, and that comes out to 58 centimeters squared. And then for our volume, it's just length times width times height. So that's going to be 6 times 4 times 0.5. And that comes out to 12 cubic centimeters. And now we're going to do the same thing we did for the other two. We're going to do 58 over 12. And we get a ratio of 4.8 to 1. So this one has almost 5 times the surface area compared to the volume, and that means that this cell, our rectangular solid, would be our most efficient cell in terms of a cell that would be the best, most likely to survive. Because, again, what does that really mean? It means it has a lot of exposed surface. Stuff can get to the middle fast. If we imagine the actual shape of this particular cell, it's a rectangle. It's kind of long and skinny. And so we can actually imagine that stuff can get to the middle very quickly, whereas with a sphere, it's going to take much longer. All right, and technically there is a shortcut for this, and they don't tell you this on the AP exam, but if you take the formulas, for example, I took the two formulas here for your sphere, the surface area and the volume. And technically, if you put the surface area formula over the volume formula, everything ends up canceling out, and you end up with 3 over the radius will give you the surface area to volume ratio in one step. So in our first problem, if you remember, our radius was 2 centimeters, and 3 over 2 gives us 1.5, and that was actually our ratio. And the same thing is true for a cube. If you take the formula, technically the formula for surface area is 6 times length times width, or side squared, and the volume was basically 1 side to the third, length times width times height. If you cancel those things out, you actually end up with 6 over the length of one side would give you the ratio, again, in one step. And so in the case of our cube, 6 over the length of one side would be 6 over 5, which basically ends up being 1.2. So technically, if you manipulate the formulas, you can get the surface area to volume ratio in one step. And the last comment I want to make to wrap this up, if they were to give you 3 cells and all 3 cells were the exact same shape, the smallest one is going to be your best one. If they give you 3 cubes and they say one has a length of 3, one has a length of 4, one has a length of 5, you do not have to work out surface area to volume ratios to solve the problem. The best one is going to be A. And the same is going to be true if you have 3 spheres. One that has a radius of 2, one that has a radius of 3, one that has a radius of 4. Your answer is going to be the small one. Why? Because the rule is that the surface area increases more slowly than the volume does. So if they're giving you the same exact shape 3 times, you're going to pick the smallest one. Because as the shape gets bigger, the surface area is going to increase more slowly than the volume is going to increase. So 3 cubes, your smallest cube is your answer. 3 spheres, your smallest sphere is your answer. All that mathematical work that I just showed you is what you would need to do if they gave you different shapes. Because that's the only way you're going to be able to compare a cube to a sphere or a rectangle to a different sized rectangle with different dimensions. But if we're just talking about 3 of the exact same shape, the smallest one's going to be the best cell, period.